given by the British Queen the right to use force in pursuit of its economic aims, came to India, and the British have always had a great gift of timing. The Mughal Empire at that point was at its peak. There was a great deal of wealth about. The Emperor Aurangzeb in 1700 had revenues that exceeded those of all the crowned heads of Europe put together. His revenues alone were 10 times greater than those of Louis XIV in Versailles. That's how wealthy and opulent he was. But in the early 18th century, after Aurangzeb, the empire began to disintegrate. It took a couple of body blows from a pair of invasions, most famously or notoriously that of the Persian king Nadir Shah in 1713, who so completely looted and devastated the Mughal capital, Delhi, that it said that nobody in Persia had to pay any taxes for the next 3 years. So much were the riches that they had taken out of India. And this weakened Mughal empire. The various governors of the provinces around the country had essentially then become, because of the central government's weakness, had become potentates, semi-independent rulers in their own right, which meant that the British, as they began to establish themselves by force of arms, never had to take on the entire might of India, but rather could sort of expand gradually by defeating one prince after another, one Nawab or Maharaja after another, and gradually spread the red stain of British rule across the subcontinent. This they did, and what they did essentially then was to proceed to deindustrialize this economy. I'll just give you a couple of examples. The textile industry was India's great triumph because going right back to the days of the Roman Empire, India was a world-renowned exporter of textiles, particularly fine cottons, muslins, gauzes, linens. And there are accounts by Pliny the Elder of debates in the Roman Senate in which senators decry that vast quantities of Roman gold were being sent off to India because of the taste of their womenfolk for these fine Indian cloths. Not only that in the Roman Empire, but I found accounts in British writings, English writings of the 17th and 18th centuries, of English shopkeepers trying to pass off shoddily made European cloth as made in India, because made in India was what had the cachet of being highly desirable, high quality cloth, sought after by the aristocracy of Europe as well as, of course, of England. There were the Dhaka gauzes, for example, said to be as light as woven air, so fine that you could pull an entire sari through a ring. And these wonderful textiles essentially could not be competed against, so the British proceeded to destroy them, smash the looms, drive the weavers out of employment. In one notorious incident, I'm careful to say one, according to oral law, there were hundreds of such incidents, but they've not all been documented, as British historians like to point out. But there is one that was documented by a contemporary Dutch observer. In one notorious incident, the British chopped off the thumbs of the weavers, so that even if the looms were rebuilt, they couldn't weave again. And the textile industry was essentially destroyed. We had the first major urban centers in the world to reduce in population, Murshidabad and Dhaka. The statistics show how these places lost people as the textile industry collapsed and the weavers were driven out of these cities into a countryside that couldn't support them. And of course, the British then imposed punitive duties and tariffs on the remaining cloth that Indians were exporting, essentially destroying the export industry. There were various other restrictions, including on shipping and so on, and lifted duties and tariffs, or since they controlled the ports, didn't have any duties and tariffs on British cloth coming into India, thereby acquiring a vast captive market through force majeure. That was the textile story in short. Shipbuilding, similar story. India had two major shipbuilding industries on the east coast and the west. Indian wood, teak and mahogany in particular, were highly sought after, lasted much longer. An average Indian ship lasted about 25 to 26 years of sailing on the high seas, whereas the average European ship made of fir or pine never lasted more than 6 or 7 years. And the craftsmanship, I've made sure to quote British sources about the high quality of Indian craftsmanship. So the British then initially, when they came, said, well, this is wonderful, why don't we make our own ships here? And they started making ships in India, but that suddenly meant large numbers of shipwrights and fitters and carpenters being thrown out of work in the London dockyards. So the British Parliament promptly passed an act that forbade ships made in India from plying the lucrative trade routes across to England and in international waters. That pretty much killed the Indian shipbuilding industry. I'm giving you short summaries. There are somewhat lengthier versions of all of this in the book. Or the steel industry. India had invented an extraordinary steel-making technology called ukku steel. The Europeans can pronounce that, so they called it Wootz steel, W-O-O-T-Z. You could look it up, but it wasn't an East European word as it sounds from the spelling. It was a mangling of an Indian name. The technology was so highly sought after, the Arabs came and learned it to make what was known as Damascus steel. And when the English soldiers first killed Indians in their early battles, they made sure to dismount and steal the Indian swords because the quality of the steel was so much superior to anything they could actually get in Europe. Well, that industry was destroyed again, and with various restrictions on what could be made, Indians were simply not allowed to make steel under either the old technology or the new techniques that came into being in the mid-19th century. And I do tell briefly the story of how in the late 19th century, when the Indian industrialist Sir Jamshedji Tata tried to manufacture steel through setting up a modern steel factory, he ran into such implacable British opposition to doing so that he spent about 20 years running around trying to get the various permissions required, was being denied throughout at every stage. Finally, he did succeed in getting the permission, but by that time he was so old that the first steel ingots were produced under the stewardship of his son. But anyway, at that time, a senior imperial official, the then chairman of the railway board, sneered that he would personally eat every ounce of steel that an Indian was capable of producing. I only regret the gentleman didn't live long enough to see the descendants of Sir Jamshedji Tata buy the remnants of British steel when they bought Chorus a few years ago. Might have given him a bad case of indigestion. But I mention these not to belabor the point, but just to say that India was systematically deindustrialized, since, of course, the counter-argument that is often made is, look, it's not our fault. Your textiles were all handloom, your steel was an old-fashioned technology, your shipbuilding was all wood. You just missed the bus for the Industrial Revolution. Well, I'm sorry, we missed the bus because you threw us under its wheels. The fact is that when you are the world leaders in the prevailing technology of the time, you are able to do well enough to buy whatever new technology is invented thereafter. And there is no question that India would have been able, as other countries did, to buy into the Industrial Revolution had it been free and allowed to do so. That's on the deindustrialization argument. But what else? You had rapacious taxation, so rapacious that contemporary accounts, and in all fairness, the historical record has been meticulously maintained by the British. You've got House of Commons testimony in repeated hearings in the late 18th century all the way up to the mid-19th century, in which you can read detailed accounts of how the East India Company's officials behaved. And by the way, don't buy the myth that this was just a corporation ruling India and not Britain. It was very much, shall we say, a mask for the British government. First of all, from 1774 onwards, the East India Company operated under a board of supervision of the Houses of Parliament. Secondly, some 28% of the shareholders of the East India Company were MPs. And thirdly, all the top officials were not only part of the British establishment, but were appointed with the knowledge and consent of the British government. So, for example, Lord Cornwallis, after surrendering to George Washington in Yorktown, was deployed to Bengal to be governor of Bengal. So there's no real distance between British colonial imperial governmental authority and the so-called corporate authority of the East India Company. It was British rule by in another form, or wearing another mask. So anyway, you can read the accounts of their taxation policies, for example. Not only was their taxation more onerous than that of the most rapacious of those who had preceded them, so onerous, in fact, that there are innumerable accounts from British sources of Indian peasants fleeing the lands controlled by the British into the still remaining Indian-ruled states, where they'd lead a more decent life. But what was worse was that the taxation was exacted pitilessly with ruthless means of enforcement, including torture, as well as with absolutely no exceptions made, because, of course, the British did everything by the book. So whereas Indian rulers could be pretty nasty too and levy taxes on people, if there was a drought, for example, or if there was a death in the peasant's family or a wedding in the peasant's family, what would happen is that the taxes would be reduced or waived or delayed or postponed. That kind of flexibility was always implicit in Indian culture. There was no room for that kind of flexibility in British culture. Everything had to be literally by the book. You will pay 85% of your crop as tax or whatever, and indeed the rates were often as high as that. And if you didn't, some of the tortures and exactions were so severe that when an account of what was done to people who couldn't pay the tax was read out in the House of Commons. In one famous incident, the playwright Sheridan's wife, Sheridan was a member of the House of Commons, swooned in the gallery on hearing how horrible her countrymen were in India and had to be carried out bodily, and this was reported in the papers at the time. So you're looking at some pretty awful behavior, but taxation was just one aspect of it. Look, for example, at famines. Now, India had had droughts before, but people had rallied around to save those who were starving or help prevent them from starving or give them charity if they were starving. A long tradition of helping those who needed food. Which is why, for example, for 2,000 recorded years of Indian history before the British came, you have, not 3,000, I beg your pardon, you have accounts of monks, whether Buddhist, Jain, or Hindu monks, going from door to door with a begging bowl, asking for food and routinely being fed. This was the normal custom in the culture. But what happened in this particular instance was that when the British came, they operated, whether in India or indeed in Ireland, on 4 sets of principles. The first was, do not give charity, because charity encourages idleness. So there was simply no question of helping people just like that. You all remember Charles Dickens's workhouses for the poor. You had to work for your money, there was no charity given. Second principle was the free market must prevail. So if you're buying grain to fill the bread baskets of London from places where there is a drought and there isn't enough grain to go around, and by your buying the grain, you're driving up the price of the scarce grain there is beyond the capacity of those who need it, who are starving, to buy it, well, tough. That's the law of the market. You buy the grain and take it off to London. Third principle was the Malthusian one. That is, as Malthus said, that if the land cannot sustain the population that's trying to live off it, then people must die. That's how the natural population balance will be reasserted. Let them die. And the fourth principle was Victorian fiscal prudence. That is, do not spend money you haven't budgeted for and never budget for a famine. So the result was an appalling situation when, in these 200 years of British rule, you have recorded evidence for at least 35 million people dying systematically as a result of British policy. And it bookends the entire British Raj. In the first famous famine of the British Raj, the Bengal famine of the 1770s, 1/3 of the entire population of the province of 6 million people died. In the last major famine of the British Raj, which was the 1943-44 Great Bengal Famine, 4.3 million people died entirely because of decisions taken by a certain Winston Churchill. Now, when you look at this and you look at the record in between, it is, as you can imagine, pretty dismaying. What's striking is, I'm sure the English people in this audience are saying, but how could we let that happen? Well, initially, these principles applied. In fact, these principles applied, as I said, across the board. So in Ireland, during the potato blight of the 1840s, this is precisely what occurred. The Irish died because these same 4 principles were applied to them, except that many Irish were able to hop onto boats and sail off to New York, and Indians didn't have that option. They just had to stay in India and die. That was essentially the alternative. In the second half of the 19th century, the Enlightenment had progressed sufficiently that British people had a public opinion, had a conscience, had a free press. There were articles about this, and people were appalled to read accounts, dispatches from India, even if they came weeks afterwards, of people dying. Lord Salisbury, the Secretary of State for India, later famous Prime Minister, talked about having sleepless nights because of the 2 million people who died on his watch in the Orissa famine of 1866, because he had agreed that these 4 principles should be applied and aid should not be given. Indeed, not just that aid should not be given, but I have recorded in my book one instance of some poor, kind-hearted gentleman, a Mr. McMillan, perhaps a good Scot, who tried to help a person starving to death, and was sternly warned by the British authorities on pain of deportation that he must stop offering charity because it was against British policy. So this is as late as the 1860s, but this had begun to create a bit of a backlash in British public opinion. So in the 1870s, they decided, all right, we still won't give charity, but we'll set up work camps so that Indians can work for food instead of starving to death. And when they did that, as Professor Mike Davies has recorded in his marvelously and painful book, Late Victorian Holocausts, the rations given to the inhabitants of the occupants of these work camps, people who had to work and toil in order to keep body and soul together, the rations given was less than half of what Hitler's Nazis gave the inmates of the Buchenwald concentration camp before sending them off to the gas chambers. So that was British colonialism at its peak. And what about the Great Bengal Famine? I should tell the story, if for no other reason than that it will shock some of you. The Great Bengal Famine occurred because, indeed, there was a drought in Bengal and supplies of grain were not available. People started starving, but Churchill had ordered that food should be procured from Bengal and shipped off to Europe, not just to aid the war effort, in fact, not to aid the war effort immediately, but to increase reserve stocks in Europe in the event of a future possible invasion of Greece and Yugoslavia. So grain was sent off from Bengal, prices became unaffordable, people started dying. The British officials, this is the 1940s after all, wrote to the Prime Minister, Mr. Churchill, saying, your decisions are causing people to die. Churchill's response was, I hate Indians, they're a beastly people with a beastly religion. It's all their fault anyway for breeding like rabbits. I mean, these are exact quotes, by the way, word for word. More people continue to die. The death toll started mounting. Ships laden with wheat from Australia were docking at Calcutta port, and the British officials wanted to disembark the wheat to save lives. Churchill said no, the ships would sail on to Europe for these buffer stocks, these reserve stocks. More people died. The figure kept mounting. It reached 4.3 million. When conscience-stricken British officials in Calcutta sent a memorandum to the Prime Minister in Downing Street about the consequences of his actions, that literally millions were dying, Churchill wrote on the margin of the file, why hasn't Gandhi died yet? And this is the man whom the British expect us to hail as some sort of apostle of freedom and democracy. As you can imagine, the very thought sticks in my craw. So that is the British record on famines. And there's more in the book, but I won't belabor too many points because I do want to leave time for an exchange with you. That's the best part of being in a university. But let me talk briefly about some of the arguments that are made for what the British did for India rather than to India. One example that is often cited is that India was unified because of the British, that there wouldn't be an India today except for British rule. First of all, the very premise is laughable because there had been an idea of India, Bharatvarsha, the land from the Himalayas to the oceans, going back to the Rig Veda, which is about 1500 BC, a good 3,000 years or more before the British got there. But what is more important was that successive Indian rulers had tried to consolidate the entire territory of today's India, and indeed more, including what's today Pakistan and Afghanistan, in their empires, and two had pretty much succeeded. The Maurya Empire under Chandragupta Maurya and Ashoka controlled about 90% of the entire subcontinent. In the 4th century and 3rd century before Christ. And the Mughals under Akbar and up to Aurangzeb in the 16th, 17th centuries controlled about 95% of the subcontinent at its peak. So the desire to control all of India as one preceded the British by a long chalk. Secondly, there was always a sense of civilizational unity in India well before the British. There was, for example, Adi Shankaracharya from my state of Kerala in the extreme south, traveling all the way to Kashmir in the north, to Dwarka in the west, to Puri in the east, and establishing his temples, his seats of religious learning, his mutts as they're called, and many, many other examples. The Harvard scholar Diana Eck writes of the sacred geography of India, knit together, she says, by countless tracts of pilgrimage. And if that seems a purely Hindu idea, let me mention that the Muslims felt the same way. Maulana Azad has written of how Indian Muslims going on the Hajj were received by and greeted by other Muslims, Arabs in particular, as all being from a common civilizational space. Whether they were Pathans from the northwest or Tamils from the southeast, these Indian Muslims were all called as Hindis, people from Al-Hind. So the world saw India as one before the British can claim credit for having knit it together. But what the British actually did was to divide it, because what they did was to essentially create the seeds of what became the destruction of this 3,000-year-old idea of India in a policy that was explicitly minuted. A wonderful thing, as I said, about British oppression is all these things are always written down. Lord Elphinstone, after seeing Hindu and Muslim soldiers fighting side by side and under each other's command, under the banner of the enfeebled Mughal monarch, against the foreign oppressor, in the so-called Mutiny of 1857, the Indian Revolt, he wrote a memo in 1858 saying, "Divide et impera" was the old Roman maxim, and it shall be ours. And of course, all of you good scholars in Edinburgh know it wasn't just a Roman maxim. It goes before the Romans to the Macedonians. It was Philip II of Macedon came up with, or Macedonia, who came up with the divide et impera phrase. But the British were the first to apply it in India, and they did it very systematically. Divide and rule became their ruling credo, and they decided that the basis of divide and rule must be religious, and there must be a conscious, deliberate attempt made to foment separate religious consciousness amongst the communities of India to prevent united opposition to them. And they did this systematically. They did it, as I've documented it in great detail in the book, sometimes through intimidation, sometimes through granting of favors, and sometimes through outright bribery. One of the more amusing episodes was how, when they partitioned Bengal in 1905 to create a Muslim-majority province in the eastern part of Bengal, the Muslim nobleman of Dhaka, Nawab of Dhaka, who was an Oxonian, absolutely refused and said, "Certainly not, this is a beastly idea, I shan't stand for it." So they slipped him £100,000 and he changed his tune. So that was the way in which these ideas were advanced. They went right through. When the British grudgingly granted very limited franchise in elections for a limited number of people to a limited number of seats in the Viceroy's Council and in provinces, so limited, in fact, that only 1 out of every 250 Indians had the vote. They still did so on the basis of separate, religiously separate communal electorates. While England would never have thought of, say, giving the Jews of Golders Green their own electoral list, in India, Muslims could only vote for Muslim candidates for seats reserved for Muslims. So this was a way of ensuring that people thought of their interests in religious grounds and thought of their political identity in religious grounds. So when the Indian National Congress established in 1885, tried to represent all Indians. In fact, if you look at a list of their first 20-odd presidents, first 20 years, you'll find Christians, Parsis, Muslims, and Hindus all presiding over the Indian National Congress. And these were largely genteel Anglophile lawyers who were writing decorous petitions seeking the rights of Englishmen for the Indians. Nonetheless, what the British did was to actually set up and encourage the setting up of a rival body, the Muslim League, organized on religious lines, rather than co-opting the one body there was if they were serious about any notions of responsible self-government. I've been given the signal that it's time for me to begin to start wrapping up, so I won't go into the other examples until we get to our Q&A, but if any of you is interested in, for example, some of the other alleged benefits of British rule, and I will give one more. The fact is that in every single case, anything you can point to that India can claim as a benefit, it is without exception something brought into India in order to serve British interests, enhance British profits, or improve British control. No other purpose. There is not one thing that was actually given to India to benefit Indians. And I'm very happy to explain that in more detail when the time comes up. I'll give you one example which is too often cited to be left out of this talk, and that's the railways. One of the things I always find people falling back upon is, well, at least we gave them the railways. Well, yes, I mean, you couldn't really take all the tracks out of the ground, could you, and take them off. But anyway, the fact is that the railways were brought in explicitly for two purposes. One was to extract resources from the hinterland and ship them to the ports to take them off to England. And the second was to send troops into the interior to quell any popular unrest. But what's more striking is that even the building of the railways was a gigantic colonial scam. What happened was that the British guaranteed to investors in the Indian railways double the dividends, double the profits that they could make on any other British government investment at that time. In other words, you got double the rate of return on the highest returning British government securities. It was the most profitable thing you could invest money in between the 1840s and the 1870s was the Indian railways. So you got the British making big profits, and all the costs were paid for by Indian taxpayers without exception. It was described at the time as private profit at public risk, except that the private profit was all British and the public risk was all Indian. So lavishly did they spend on this, because they were making money out of it at every stage, that 1 mile of British railway at that time of British Indian railway, I beg your pardon, not in Britain, but India, cost 9 times what the same mile was costing at the same time in the US or Canada. That was how extortionate even the construction of the railways was. And as I've described in the book in greater detail than I have time for now, it was also run as a completely racist enterprise, right down to the fact that when passenger wagons were eventually added with wooden slats for benches for the Indians to sit and travel on, the Indian passengers paid the highest passenger rates of any railway in the world, whereas the British companies paid the lowest freight rates of any companies in the world, of any railways in the world, to ship their goods on these railways. It was only after independence that India reversed this pattern and made it now the cheapest form of railway travel in the world anywhere, though unfortunately also amongst the most expensive ways of shipping freight. But let me end by answering a question that many ask. What's the point of all this now? It's been 70 years, they're gone. What do you want out of this? And as I said, I'm not really looking for reparations, but I am looking for atonement. I think there is a moral debt that needs to be paid, far more than a financial one. And to my mind, that can take a couple of fairly obvious forms. The first is, as I say to my British friends, for God's sake, teach unvarnished colonial history in your schools. It is shocking that you can do A-levels in history in England today without learning a line of colonial history. The week my book came out in India, by coincidence, there was an article by a Pakistani journalist in The Guardian about raising 2 children, one of the best and most expensive public schools in London, who'd both done A-levels in history and hadn't heard a thing about colonial history. That's got to change. And I think that must really change in the interests of Britain as well. I recount, for example, a passage in the book about Horace Walpole, taking a carriage down a London street and describing building after building that has been built by Indian money. He called London a sinkhole of Indian wealth. Nobody in London today has any idea that so much of London's, of the grand mansions, were built by money extracted from the colonies. You have undoubtedly the big concerns about the way in which history is remembered. All you've got now is either historical amnesia, no teaching of history, or, I mean, in the schools. I know you can study Indian history in universities if that's your subject, but obviously for a lot of people it won't be. But you don't actually learn all this there. And so there's no sense of the colonial connectivity. I remember being struck by a wonderful protest by a number of black and brown Britons objecting to all the anti-immigrant language in the political space a few years ago. And the photograph I saw in the newspapers was of these black and brown people holding up placards that read, in London this is, holding a placard saying, "We are here because you were there." And it's shocking, it was surprising to me that the Britons actually needed to be reminded of that. That is something that perhaps is worth talking about. The other thing worth talking about is the fact that in a country overflowing with museums, I mean, London is a capital littered with museums. One thieves' market after another. I mean, every single thing practically in all these museums was purloined from some colony over the last few centuries. There's even an Imperial War Museum, but there is no museum to colonialism. There is nothing where a school child or a tourist or a visitor can go and see the whole story of what Britain did and gained from the various parts of the world it ruled. As I said in the Oxford debate, yes, the sun never set on the British Empire because even God couldn't trust the Englishman in the dark. But that's because they were there helping themselves to everything they could find in all these places around the world. And it would be good if a museum were constructed to show it. It'd be good if there were monuments. It's striking that in the heart of London there is a statue to the animals that fought with the Allies in the 2 world wars. But there is no statue to the Indian soldiers who fought in the 2 world wars. 1.3 million Indians fought in the First World War, 1.7 million in the Second World War. Over 150,000 Indians perished in defense of Britain's freedoms. And no statue. I mean, it's really quite remarkable, actually, when you think about it. I think in the First World War, more Victoria Crosses were won by Indians than by British soldiers. There were the famous Battle of Ypres, which stopped the German advance at the very beginning of the war when Britain was otherwise unprepared to resist the advance. Here you have Indian soldiers sailing to Egypt who were suddenly diverted onto Belgium because war had been declared and who were able to stop the German advance in Ypres and Neuve-Chapelle. You've got all these stories that are essentially unknown in Britain today. And I think, again, that needs to be told. But it's not just about remembering. The remembering is important. I'm always saying to young Indians, if you don't know where you've come from, how will you appreciate where you're going? And I think that's true for British young people too. But it's something more, and that's perhaps the difficult part with which I'll conclude. I think that one essential form of atonement is an apology. Now, I know many Britons will say, but why should we apologize? We haven't done anything to the Indians. What's more, there's nobody really alive today who profited much from the British Raj or did anything to the Indians. And in any case, there's nobody alive in India today who directly, suffered at the point of a British bayonet or whatever. So why should we apologize? To which I will point to 2 counterexamples. First, the German Chancellor Willy Brandt sinking to his knees in the Warsaw Ghetto in the 1970s in apology for what the German Nazis had done to the Polish Jews. Now, Willy Brandt was a social democrat. People like him had been persecuted by the Nazis. He was completely innocent of any taint of Nazi wrongdoing. But he felt, as the embodiment of the German state, that it's never too late to do the right thing, that he needed to apologize on behalf of the German people. And the second example I would point to is from somebody you honored in this university just a year or 2 ago, Justin Trudeau. The Prime Minister of Canada apologized to the people of India in the Canadian Parliament for one incident, the so-called Komagata Maru incident, when a Japanese ship, the Komagata Maru, laden with Indian refugees fleeing British rule, was turned away at gunpoint from the port of Vancouver, and pretty much everybody on board later perished either on the high seas or at British hands when they landed. And that was not a direct crime in that Canada didn't actually kill people, but because they contributed indirectly to their deaths and they turned away asylum seekers, Trudeau felt it was right to apologize. That's something that Britain has never done. And I have the perfect occasion to suggest, because on the 13th of April 2019, you will have the centenary of the single worst atrocity of the British Raj in India. Not the worst in terms of numbers of people killed. The British killed some 100,000 people in Delhi alone in 1857-58 in putting down the so-called mutiny. But in terms of everything that happened around it, and I'll take 5 minutes just to tell you that story and I'll end and take your questions. What the British did was, as I said, India supported them in the First World War, and they said that they would accept this support, which, by the way, wasn't just the 1.3 million soldiers. It was vast sums of money from a starving country, money paid for not just by the treasuries of the Maharajas, but by poor Indian taxpayers at the time when the Spanish flu had taken a larger toll in India than any other country because our public health under British rule was in such bad shape. But India also supplied food, clothing, uniforms, carts, pack animals, and even rail lines ripped out of the ground to go and aid the war effort in Europe and Mesopotamia. And they did so because the British promised them responsible self-governance at the end of the war. And Indian leaders, including Mahatma Gandhi, who called for support for the war effort, assumed this meant dominion status, which was what the so-called white Commonwealth countries like Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa enjoyed at the time. Well, perfidious Albion broke its word, won the war and didn't keep its promise. Not only no responsible self-government, but in fact, Britain chose to reimpose the wartime era prohibitions on freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and so on. Whereupon protests immediately broke out across British India. The British responded by declaring martial law. They didn't use the word, but they sent British generals and soldiers to quell unrest throughout British India. And a man called Brigadier General Reginald Dyer showed up in the Punjab town of Amritsar to keep the peace there, declared that people could not assemble in groups of more than 5, but he didn't realize, or he'd overlooked, that this was the Punjabi spring festival of Baisakhi. And in fact, large numbers of people, both from Amritsar and from the surrounding villages, had gathered to commemorate Baisakhi in a walled garden, Jallianwala Bagh, with just one gate, one entrance to it. And these were men, women, and children, in fact, large numbers of women and children. There was song and dance and speechifying, and maybe some of the speeches were hostile to Britain, but there certainly wasn't a single weapon in sight. Dyer heard these people had gathered. He marched there with his soldiers, didn't ask them why they were there, did not order them to disperse, did not even fire a warning shot. He just ordered his soldiers to assemble at the gate, the sole entrance and exit to the garden, and to open fire on these unarmed civilians. 1,650 bullets were fired, and Dyer proudly boasted not a single bullet was wasted. As the wailing, screaming crowd rushed to the exits, as Dyer proudly told the Inquiry Commission later, they made easier targets, that's why I put my soldiers at the gate. Every bullet struck somebody. The British acknowledged 379 dead. The Indians claim the figure was over 1,000, but certainly the bullet marks still stand. It was a horrendous massacre. But worse was to follow. Not only were these people killed, and others deeply wounded and maimed, but Dyer barricaded the gates and left the dead, the dying, and the wounded to rot for 24 hours in the hot April sun. Those still alive were wailing piteously for water, and their families standing at the gate couldn't go in and help them. Dyer ordered Indians to crawl on their bellies on a side lane, and if they so much as lifted their heads were bashed in by British staves. After all this, as you can imagine, there was an uproar, there was a commission of inquiry, the House of Commons censured him. The House of Lords, however, not only exonerated him, but praised him. That flatulent voice of Victorian imperialism, Rudyard Kipling, called him the man who saved India. A collection was raised for him amongst the British in India and in London, and the princely sum in today's money of £250,000 was given to him together with a bejeweled sword. This entire package of events, the ingratitude for the support in the war, the betrayal of promises, the cruelty of the massacre, the indifference to Indian suffering afterwards, the racism that accompanied it, and then the self-justification and exoneration of the man, all of this put together makes Jallianwala Bagh the single worst atrocity of the British Raj in India. Now, can you imagine if on the centenary of that event, a member of the British royal family, because everything after all was done in the name of the crown, and no politician from Britain is likely to do this, but if a member of the British royal family were to come to Amritsar, and ideally like Willy Brandt, sink to their knees and beg forgiveness or express remorse and seek or even apologize for the horrendous wrong that was done in that incident 100 years earlier on that spot, and by extension for all the wrongs of 200 years of British rule, think what an extraordinary message that would send and what a cleansing effect it would have on the indelible stain of 200 years of British colonialism in India. I rest my case. Thank you very much.